Good evening, everyone. Hi, everyone. And welcome. On behalf of Norfolk County Public Library, thank you for joining us tonight. We're thrilled to host this special event with Jennifer Robson and to share the time with so many members of our community. Thank you, everyone. Before we begin, I'd just like to go over a few important housekeeping and safety items so everyone feels comfortable and informed. So, in the event, I feel like I should get up and do one of those things like airline seatbelt. In the event of an emergency, please take note of the nearest exits. At the back there with Jennifer Carrier, there's an exit up there and to the left and up the stairs and out to Talbot Street. The other is out this door, same way you came in. Those are the emergency exits. And the washrooms are located through that exit door at the back. If you require an elevator, it's in that hallway. And up you go through the elevator. I want to acknowledge Jennifer Carrier. She was instrumental in putting this evening together, making the contacts and getting it all sorted out. Thank you, Jennifer. We have Craig Kitchen at the top of the stairs, capturing anyone who's a straggler to come, and he'll usher them down. And we have Katie Dawson. Katie Dawson is in the hall. She greeted everyone as they came in. And we have Belinda Smith, who is doing the tech work here and the camera work, because we are live on YouTube. And so just take a moment and note those emergency features. And as a reminder, if you have a mobile phone or any mobile device, please silence it and or turn it off so that we are not disturbed by someone's curious ringtone. And then after this conversation with the author, there will be time for questions and book signing, book purchasing, and we'll open it up to more refreshments. If you haven't already eaten everything, it's back there. So we're very pleased that everyone is here and to join us for an event like this. And as we begin, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Robson. I thought the clipboard would be helpful, but apparently it's not. It's not. It's to take it out with a flourish. Probably not. So here we go. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you our special guest today, the acclaimed voice in contemporary historical fiction and beloved author whose works have captivated readers across Canada and indeed across the world. Jennifer Robson is internationally known bestseller of 7 novels, including Somewhere in France, The Gown, and most recently Coronation Year, and there's another one coming. Her stories are known for their rich historical detail, compelling characters, and deeply human truths that reveal resilience, love, and the quiet courage of everyday people, especially women living through extraordinary times. Feels like right now. Yeah. Before becoming a full-time writer, Jennifer earned a doctorate in British economic and social history at Oxford. Her background in academia brings a rare depth and authenticity to her work, blending rigorous research with vivid storytelling that makes the past feel immediate and alive. Jennifer's books have been translated into multiple languages, featured on bestseller lists, and selected for book clubs across the globe. She's also a dedicated champion of libraries and a generous mentor to emerging writers. Again, please join me in warmly welcoming Jennifer Robson. As we move forward, this is a panel-style, interview-style discussion. I will ask some questions and guided questions. Jennifer will expand on them, and we'll go for a period of time here and then open it up to questions from you at the end.
That's wonderful. And I'm a long question answerer. My husband teases me that this is my way of, I never ended up teaching at university, but it's sneaking mini lectures in to stun everyone. But as soon as he said, you could just answer yes or no is applicable occasionally. And well, he's an engineer. I feel as he thinks in binary, right? And
Yes,
my brain is not that way. Not at all.
Oh, I appreciate that. Great. Well, let's start with first question I have here. And can you walk us through a typical writing day in your life?
Well, I can't, except the writing days tend to vary depending on what stage of a book I'm at. And right now I'm in the very final stages of producing a first draft of what will be my next book that I feel that I won't feel mortified handing over to my editor and my literary agent. And so far, my sister and a couple of my closest friends have seen chunks of it, but I don't tend to share it that much, most because I get nervous that I also have this imagining in my head that I'll get an email from my editor saying, no, this is, yeah, you're gonna have to write another one, this isn't good. And, which has not happened. But so at the moment I'm in the kind of the frenzy stage. So today has been a really nice diversion from that, of getting in the car, driving, looking at all this greenery and blue sky. It's beautiful. And whereas, tomorrow, for example, will be, up with the larks. And then once I get the kind of the routine of getting everyone out the door over with, which sometimes involves driving my daughter to school, it appears that if there's a drop of rain in the sky, that it makes using the bus and the subway impossible. And every time I start to complain about that, I remind myself she's off to university out east in the fall, and there will be days where I'll be very sad to not have her there to drive her to school. But then, once I'm up and at 'em, it's off to my desk, and right now I'm not researching, I'm writing the book, and I just fall into the manuscript to the point where sometimes I realize I'm not looking up for 3 to 4 hours, which is not fabulous and so I have my watch set to beep at me and to say, get up, and I don't always listen to it, and most of the time it depends. We have a wonderful dog who's 3, and twice a week goes off to a little doggy daycare we call school, so she can play with other dogs. And but on the day she's home, she's the one who comes and nudges me and says, "Come on, we've got to go. I've got to go, and you need to walk." So that will get me up, and that's actually a kind of a refreshing thing to do in terms of, I don't know, resetting my brain a little bit. And that'll go on till kind of the end of the afternoon. So I'm putting in probably, I would say, 8-hour days. And then the vortex of home time from school, dinner, homework. Some of you follow me on social media might have seen that my daughter does the Scottish Highland dancing. So I proudly call myself a dance mom. And so I'm often driving her across the city, which in Toronto means a torturous hour of traffic each way. And then I will often just sit and work while she's at dance. And then, once I hand in the manuscript, I collapse for a week or two, very dramatically, the whole collapse onto my fainting couch. And then while I'm waiting for the edits, that's when I usually start thinking about the next book. Now I will say I've taken a little bit of a sabbatical, so I pretty much paused writing for about a year and a half, and that came in the wake of, I finished Coronation Year, and was just about to launch into the next book, and my father passed away. And that combined with, that kind of hit, that happened, and then just to make things even just more wonderfully special, menopause hit. I see, I know, I'm really among friends. Menopause hit me like an anvil falling out of the sky, and I suddenly stopped sleeping, and just all sorts of, it's just, I feel like all of my get-togethers with my friends are us comparing strange things that are happening to us. It was saying, it's a burning metallic taste in her mouth all the time, and I thought, okay, that, count myself fortunate, that just has not happened, but it really I could not, the words weren't coming, the characters weren't coming, and it was really only this spring that I just felt like myself again, and I could start writing again. And since then, the book has, I will say, I'm not sleeping well just because the characters are impertinent enough to wake me up and want to have conversations. And but this manuscript will be done, and I have formally committed to handing it into my editor on July 31st. And the last 2 weeks of July are going to be pretty. I've warned my family, do not expect any food. Like, there's no food. The laundry service will be discontinued. Just fend for yourselves. The kids are 21 and 18. They're completely fine. And and then I'll have a pause and I'll start another one. So what I want to say, though, is that this next book will not be on shelves until probably another 18 months. I'm so sorry. It takes forever. The publishing cycle is very, very glacial, on top of my being glacial. So it'll be a little while, but then I am really happy with it so far. So I'm hoping everyone will like it. Yeah.
That's a wonderful response, because it leads right into my next question. Do your characters ever surprise you and take the story in an unexpected direction? And you just mentioned that you have an impertinent character, so it does fall.
They do. They're very well.
Yes.
So 2 books ago, my book Our Darkest Night, which was it was another one of these books that I'd actually been working on something else, and it wasn't coming to me. The characters weren't talking, and then the idea for this book just landed on me, and I wrote it. I probably wrote it in 6 months, which is fast for me. And for 6 months to the first draft. After that, there was still a lot of work that was needed to make it publishable. And in the first draft that I handed in, and I don't want to give too much away, but there was a central character that in the first draft I killed, and wept bitter, bitter tears as I was murdering this character on the page. Bitter, bitter tears, and to the point where I think my daughter ran upstairs and said, "Mom, are you okay? What's that?" I'll tell you later. And even as I did it, and I handed it in the first draft, I had the sense that my editor, who's called Tessa, and my agent would both say, "Jen, this is way too sad, especially for a book that came out during COVID. You do not want to do this to people. It's so sad." And so they did get back to me, and I remember Tessa saying, "You're going to kill me for saying this, Jen," which always prefaces her wanting to change the book a lot. And she said, "You're going to kill me, but I just don't think you can let this character die. I think it's going to devastate people, and people will be really upset. But also, it just doesn't give it. The book ends on a very miserable, hopeless note because of it." And I had to agree with her. So then I went back and rewrote it. But I think a lot of the emotion that went into watching this character die, like not really at my hands, it was the Nazis who did it, but still, like watching this character die and then finding ways to resurrect this character, the emotion that I layered into it remained. So I'm glad I tried the other way and then realized, no, that's not. It's the kind of book where people will be talking about afterwards, saying, "I loved it up until what happens, and then I threw it across the room," and I didn't really want to do that to people. But all the time, the characters will be having conversations that I feel as if I'm overhearing. And I know it sounds super woo-woo, and I don't, I'm not given to kind of woo-woo stuff, but as I'm writing, the characters start talking. It feels very independent of any decisions I'm making. And sometimes I'll set out to write a chapter, and it's happening right now. I'll be writing the chapter, fleshing it out, and by the end of the chapter, my characters are doing something quite different from what I had planned when I started it. And then I have to go, well, now I have to figure out what to do with you people. This is insane. And so then that's usually when I have to go on a walk with my dog, and I'm going to mutter to myself as I'm walking around. I'm sure my neighbors, the close neighbors know what I do, and they all seem, I think they think there's some kind of mysticism involved. I'm busy writing another book as if I'm chanting or something in my office. But there is a kind of an alchemy that happens that is unpredictable, and and this is a feeling that's shared by all of my friends who are writers. You know when the book is working, and you know when it isn't, and you can't predict before you start what's going to happen and how the book will unfold once you get into it. But that's the best feeling when the characters start to take over. And I think, again, every writer I know, we have this experience of turning in a manuscript, and you turn it in, and by the point you've turned it in, I remember this with my doctoral thesis as well, turning it in, finally handing it in to be judged or to be assessed, and then someone asking me what it was about, and I just remember staring at her, and I couldn't remember. All I'd done for the previous 6 weeks was work kind of 18 hours a day and finishing this 100,000 word thesis, and I remember looking at my upstairs neighbor, and I couldn't tell her. I was just, and she finally said, you know what, honey, I think you should go to bed. So I know when I hand in this book, I will have read it and reread it, but I'll need a week or 2 weeks away from it, and then I'll go back and read it with a fresher eye, at which point I catch all the mortifying mistakes I made and in typos and things that I left in. But I'll also find passages that I don't really remember writing. I have a vague memory of it, and I know it came out of my head, but still I'm looking at going, that is not bad. Who was the person who took over? Because that part I really like. It does feel mysterious, and I wish I could harness it, that it wasn't unpredictable, right? And sometimes you just have to wait for it. And with this latest book, I've had to wait for everything to come together, but I hope people will be happy in the end. Yeah.
I'm sure we will. I know we will. I will, whatever it is. So next question here is, what is the hardest and most rewarding parts of writing historical fiction?
I think the hardest part, but then the most rewarding when you achieve it is feeling that you have captured the past in a credible and plausible way, to the point that people who were alive then would feel that their lives and concerns were reflected accurately. Now, the farther back you go, the harder that is to do. And at the moment I'm writing books that are set in kind of the fairly recent past, where it is not uncommon for people to come up to me who've lived through those years and say, I lived through the war. I was a little kid. I grew up in Britain, and I lived through it. And for them to then say something positive about the fact that I've captured their concerns and is amazing. It's the best compliment I could ever get. But I certainly, and I know this is true of my friends who write in similar veins, you're sweating those details when you're writing the book, because I do want to do justice. I mean, of all generations, I really want to do justice to people who lived through the Second World War. If it's my grandparents' generation, I feel personally indebted. I think we all do to a certain degree, and to the generation that lived through the Great War. Everybody who was alive, during the Great War is gone now, more or less. The last of the veterans died when I first started, around the time I first started writing. And I was conscious of this feeling that the last living memories of that war and its aftermath were being lost. And we're in a generation now where there's fewer and fewer veterans at each Remembrance Day, and we all read the stories and see the statistics about how few people have any idea of what happened in the war. As a historian, obviously that gets me worked up. But I think the answer to that is not to just kind of throw up our hands and say, oh well, kids these days. It's to find ways of engaging people with recent history. And you know, one way I've tried to approach that is with this notion of, and I explore this in an essay in the that's at the end of Our Darkest Night, where I talk about the idea of being a vicarious witness. So I was not alive. I was born in 1970. Was not alive during the Second World War. So I cannot claim to have any firsthand knowledge whatsoever of it. But I'm a pretty good listener, and I'm really, really interested in the stories of people who lived through those years. And so as their voices disappear, as their voices fade, it's up to people like me, like writers, academics, artists, musicians, poets. We're the ones, I think, who have been left with this task of standing in as witnesses. At no point do I ever believe that I'm at the center of the story. I'm just reflecting other people's stories. But if we don't tell the stories, then they really will be lost. And so there's that feeling of an obligation to get it right, even in the small details, right? And because I'm aware there are enough people who live through this time that if I mess up the small details, they're not going to believe the big stuff, right? And so I do spend an inordinate amount of time obsessing over describing things the right way, making sure if I'm describing what's in somebody's kitchen that I've got it right. I haven't put something there that a woman in Britain in 1947 would not recognize, right? And I do make mistakes, and people are kind enough to let me know, and I endeavor not to ever do it again. But you know, that's the fun of it too. So it's, you know, it can be a little stressful at times, but it's also a bit of a detective hunt to figure out what belongs there, what doesn't, and how can I make this book as without benefit of a time machine, how can I get as close to it as possible? You know, that's what gets me out of bed in the mornings, I think, in terms of my work. Actually, when we're talking literally, it's my cats who wake me at 5 every morning with the dawn chorus of meow, 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 meow. But
the dawn chorus.
The dawn chorus, with the pre-dawn chorus, I have to say, some mornings.
Well, thank you for that. That's very descriptive of the process. Thank you. Next question I have for you is, why did you choose historical fiction as your primary genre?
So when I started writing, my daughter, who's now 18, was a newborn, and her brother was a very busy 2.5-year-old. And I'd gone on mat leave from my position at Penguin Books Canada, where I worked. I worked in the marketing department, writing the cover copy that goes in books, and we used to actually have cataloging the book contents, and so I'd work with the writers on that, and it was a good job, but it was let's fair, it was an incredibly low-paid job, and I was not prepared to sink every penny of what I made into going back to work and to have someone else take care of my children for a job that wasn't really that fabulous. So I'd stayed at home working as a freelancer, but I was also realizing that I was spinning my wheels. And I had this very fine education from Oxford that I wasn't really doing much with. And I also had, more crucially for me, I had the example of my late mom, who was a provincial court judge, and my grandmother, who was a journalist for most of her working life. And these incredible women as role models, and then here I was content to just kind of not do much with the education I had, so I really woke up one day and thought, I gotta do something else, and what am I gonna do? And it hit me, I had an idea rolling around in the back of my head for a while that I wanted, maybe one day I would write a book about a woman living through the First World War and her experiences, not as reflected through the prism of a man's experiences, but what happens to her. And I thought, well, there's no time like the present. And so I started small. I just started writing an hour every few days, because that's all I could carve out with, Fussy Baby and Rambunctious Toddler. And then I made it a really regular kind of time, the nap time, I would do that and carved out just little chunks of time. And after about a year, I had a manuscript, which I then couldn't sell. Nobody wanted a book about the First World War. This was 2009, I think. And then very handily, Julian Fellows created the series Downton Abbey, which fed into my master plan. I had no plan. There was no plan. But when it hit the airwaves and became this monster hit, I suddenly thought, oh, okay. And even then, I wasn't really going to do anything about it. But one of my closest friends started pestering me. This is the time to do something about it. She'd read the manuscript. You'll be able to get it published. Go out and do it. So I tried again, and I did this time find an agent, and I sold it to William Morrow, and then Summer in France became the sleeper hit that just keeps selling and selling and selling, and astonishes. At HarperCollins, they called it the little book that could, because nobody expected it to sell more than like a few hundred copies. And then, wow, I think it's, I don't know exactly. I'm not great at keeping track, but it sold a lot of copies over the years. And so it was just because I had this interest in this one topic that happened to be historical fiction. And then the next topic was, almost a sequel to the first book. Well, then that was historical fiction as well. And that's where I became comfortable. And it's not that I, and I certainly have an interest in writing contemporary fiction and maybe veering off into other genres. But it's where I feel at home, I think, because the one thing I do feel confident about is my knowledge of the history of, say, the first 2/3 of the 20th century. I teach it, I've researched it, I've written a doctoral thesis on a subject kind of that cleaves to that. So I feel at home there. If you were to ask me to write a book of like speculative fiction set in the future, I think I would struggle. I mean, I like reading science fiction. I don't know if I could write that personally. Or even to go back, really, could I write something set in the early Middle Ages? I'd probably have to take time off and do a really intensive deep dive into the history before I could then feel comfortable that I would produce something that isn't wallpaper history.
Right.
Anybody can write historical fiction if the goal is to skim, right? You just throw in talking about a corset here, a petticoat there, whatever. But readers are smart, and even if you don't necessarily have a degree in costume history, people can tell if you've just kind of pasted it on. And conversely, people can tell if you've really, really put in the work to really get inside kind of not just the minds and hearts of people, but to try and walk in their shoes and have an understanding of what their lives were like. And so it's pure comfort, kind of self-serving comfort. But with that said, the next book that's coming out, it will be primarily history is its focus, but it will depart from the norm in some ways, which I'm not yet allowed to tell anyone about. But that will be soon. But it'll be very recognizably one of my books. It just will be a little more adventurous, let's put it that way. So, sorry to throw that out.
No teasers for us.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh. All right, then the next question I have for you is, how do you ensure historical accuracy without sacrificing the narrative drive?
Yeah, the dreaded info dump that we all worry about.
Yeah.
So that's a kind of it's a twofold thing, that the historical accuracy, I mean, it helps that I have a pretty thorough training as an historian. That's what I got from Oxford, is I learned how to do research. And I also learned how to do research old school, which is to say, by opening books and reading them, and going to newspaper libraries and trawling through microfilm and going through many books that were not digitized and were not searchable. And at one point I sat down and I tried to figure out, so my doctoral research took me 2.5 years, full-time, in archives, libraries, 5 days a week, and I didn't take the summers off. I just worked straight through, and to get the information I needed. And today, the same sources are there that I use, but they've all been digitized, which means they're searchable. I could probably do the same research in 6 months.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
now, then I would have lost out on 2 glorious years at Oxford, so it's not like it was a hardship, right? Oh, I'm dragging myself into the Bodleian, the hellhole, it's the Bodleian. And, living in Oxford, if only the city were more beautiful. So it was not, but, it was expensive. I was fortunate enough to be there on a scholarship, but it's expensive. And so, I had to learn how to find things without there was no Google. I was trying to think about this. We had email, and that was it. The first search engines weren't coming out until I was at the very end of my doctoral studies. And so when I needed something, I had to physically go to the repository that held it, and search through bound catalogs. It took a lot of time. And so now what I find is I still know where to find everything, but I can do it sitting at home in Toronto, with access through the various libraries that I've always used, including the Bodleian. I have reader's tickets still, even all these years later. As a little aside, one of the things you have to do when you start at Oxford is you go to the main office at the Bodleian Libraries, which have been open since the 1570s, I think. And an oath is put before you, written out in whatever language you choose. I think there's 70 different languages you can, because they want it to be in your first language. And you read out an oath, and then solemn promises of your conduct when you're at the library. And among them, it includes you're not allowed to build any fires in the library. Because when it was first opened, obviously no central heating, and students would bring in little charcoal braziers and light them to keep their feet warm, and which led to some distressing fires. So once you have that Bodleian reader's ticket, as long as you reapply at suitable junctures, you can keep it. And so I do all of that. It's using modern technology, but my approach is still that. And you think of it almost as an archaeological dig. You're starting at the surface, and then you're just digging down layer by layer. And with the kind of the layer where all the treasure is the layer of primary. It almost sounds like primary sources, which is to say the undiluted original voices of people who lived in the past, or as close to it as you can get. Much easier to find the voices of people alive in the 1950s than the 1550s, but it's still possible. And that's what I'm looking at every time. Now, what I do in that first draft is an overabundance of research, to the point where, and I edit as I go along. I worked as an editor for 15 years, so I self-edit, but the first draft of every chapter is always just awash in details that really no one needs to know or would care to know. And then I pull back on that, and I know I've kind of hit the sweet spot where there's enough that my editor isn't saying this is too much, Jen. And very occasionally she's saying, I want to know a little bit more about what they ate at that meal, or tell me a little bit more about this building. Then I feel as if I'm hovering in that zone of enough but not too much, right? One rule I use, and this is just a rule that I think is good for anybody who's an aspiring writer, is no one ever walks into their own house and stands in the front hall, looks around, and assesses, unless they're about to do reno or something, and assesses, oh, look at that interesting mirror there, and then there's that artwork, and oh, that's over there. It's only when you're new to a place, you're coming to a place for the first time, or a place you know that's radically changed, that you look around and you assess your surroundings. And so it's very tempting when you're writing a narrative passage that describes a place, for example, or describes a person, that you, as the writer, will go into all scads of detail about what they look like and your impressions, when in reality a character, if it's someone they see every day or a place they go every day. They're not thinking that. So how do you get the detail you need? Well, ideally, at least one of your characters is a newcomer, they're fish out of water, they're the ones providing the observational stuff. Or you sneak it in other ways. But I always have to keep in mind when I'm so anxious to tell all of you, I have to tell you every detail of this building called the Blue Lion. Look, I've got it, I gotta show you. They'll give you the grand tour. And then remind myself, okay, well, Edie, who's the owner of the hotel, is not, unless she's going around looking for, oh, there's a dust over there, or this picture is askew. She's not going around assessing and thinking about what it looks like. But Stella, who is another character who's just arrived at the hotel, of course she's looking because she's interested and this is a new place. So it's all about point of view, and I just have to, that's one of the things that as I layer the details on in the course of editing and refining the book, that's when I try to get to that sweet spot. But as you can see from my long answer, it's not a straightforward process.
Well, you did let us know you're a long
A long
answer.
answer.
Yes.
What's the point in saying yes or no? My brain is not binary. It doesn't work that way.
Another question here is, what ethical responsibilities do you feel when writing about real historical events or people?
I feel them pretty strongly in that, well, there, again, even if I'm writing about the First World War, but there's still family members alive of people who lived through that time, and people who were affected. We're all affected to one degree or another by these wars, and the kind of generational trauma that they afflicted. And I just, as a historian, with I want to maintain a reputation as somebody who gets things right, but also just I guess there's a kind of a moral center to it that taking history and playing fast and loose with the facts is reprehensible. And I'm not going to go off on a political tangent because then we would just be here all night, but I do find it very morally reprehensible to see, and not just in the United States, it's happening all over the world, where governments are working, and it's not new, this has always happened, rewriting history to suit their own purposes, and suppressing the study of some aspects of history, and so our knowledge of it becomes imbalanced, and then promoting views of history that are, quite frankly, wrong, and are indefensible from the point of view of, if you're a professional historian, what is being done is indefensible, and they're playing fast and loose with the truth, and I don't ever want to be on the side of somebody who, it might seem, I'm not crafting public policy, I'm not a statesperson, but I think for me to willingly twist history to my own ends, for my own agenda, it would be deeply wrong. So what I do is I try and take kind of my knowledge as an historian and make the best judgments I can as I'm writing a book as to, is this accurate, is this fair, does this fairly represent the point of view and the lived experience of people from that time. There's no such thing as being completely neutral. We all try. Well, some of us try harder than others, but I try to be as neutral as possible, which is not to say I don't have strong opinions, but I try and, and this is not me, like, people are like, you have to be neutral, and I'm like, no, when you're talking about Nazis, there's no need for neutrality whatsoever. You will never catch me writing anything positive about a Nazi, right? It's just that's never going to happen. But in terms of trying to have a balanced view of people's concerns and worries at a particular point in history, that's something I work hard on achieving. But it's not perfect. I'm sure if we could, again, grab a time machine, pull somebody forward from the middle of World War II, have them read one of my books set in World War II, and say, is this does this fully capture your lived experience? And they probably say, well, I don't know, there's some bits, but the other bits are, I don't know what she's talking about here. But at least I'm trying. It's not just a kind of a, how should I put it, something I think about in a casual way. It's something I've become quite obsessed with over the course of writing these books. Ultimately, I also feel if I get things wrong because I've been lazy, readers will know, people know, and then I'll disappoint people, which is not what I set out to do. So, I'm also aware that when people, whether you borrow books or you're buying books, whether or not you're paying for the book, you're investing your time in it, right? There's nothing worse than getting like way into a book and then having the author do something that disappoints you so much you set it aside. And I never want to be that person, apart from occasionally trying to murder some of my characters. They're very resistant to being murdered, I have to say.
Well, that leads into my next question is, how do you build your characters? Do you start with a biography, a dialogue, or the relationships?
So with the book I'm working on now, it's the two central characters just jumped into my head, and I knew where they were. I could see them very vividly right away, and their names came very quickly. And I can't start writing a book until I have the characters' names. That's an obsession with me. And I'm also very picky about making sure that the names are correct for the period. There are lots of, for example, the name Madison, right? And I know a couple of girls called Madison, and it's a beautiful name. But that name for girls did not really exist. You won't find it in say, U.S. Census records before the release of Splash, which was the early 1980s, Tom Hanks, Daryl Hannah, and the mermaid was called Madison. And it's only at that point that you see the name Madison showing up as a name for girls. You might have seen it for boys occasionally. It might have been somebody's surname, but that's an example. And so if I were to see a book that's set in the 1930s with a female character called Madison, well, it's not like I'm going to write an angry email to the author, but I would then, the first thing I would think is I'm not sure how deeply they've researched this period. And unless there's a very compelling reason for that girl to have that name. And so, most people, most men, by a large margin, say living in this part of Canada in the last century, by a large margin, most men were called John. That's just a fact. And then you can go through the basic, straightforward names, and the top 100 do not really change that much. And certainly the top 10 or so for the first half of the 20th century they're pretty similar. So for me to kind of go and suddenly make up a name or have it be really out there, that's the first thing that's going to throw people off. So once the name is established, then I start building the characters in terms of how did they grow up, what was their family life like, who are their closest friends. One thing I do, and I'm not the only author to do this, is I'll take sample questions from Marcel Proust's questionnaire, which he invented as a parlor game in the late 19th century, and you see it in the back of Vanity Fair each month. CBC Radio, I've done the Proust questionnaire, and it asks lots of what's your greatest fear, what's your greatest disappointment, is there anyone you hate in this world? All sorts of kind of really big questions. The idea of just sitting in a parlor with your glass of absinthe and answering these questions I find kind of hilarious. But I have maybe 20 questions, and if I can answer all those questions for my central characters, then I know them. Sometimes all the answers don't come right away. It's only when I'm farther into writing the book. But at this stage, for the two characters of the book I'm working on now, I can answer all those questions. And I know, you won't see it on the page, the things that happened to them when they were little kids, for example. But I know it. And prepare, it doesn't show, I'm not going to mention it, but I think it seeps through all the same. Yeah.
It's
there's a method to madness, I like to think.
Method of madness. Well, here's another question on the topic of building your characters. Many of your protagonists are women facing complex challenges. Why is this perspective important to you?
I think it comes from just, I start with the example of my mom and my grandma, who both were women working in fields that were heavily dominated by men, and having to carve out a space for themselves, and so they could live and work with dignity. And it wasn't always easy. And I figured that's so close to home that that's only two examples among millions of stories of women. And, you know, I've had people jokingly say, aren't you interested in men? And I would say, yeah, but I'm more interested in women's stories. And, you know, there's no shortage of stories being told about men. Really, I don't think men have to worry about it anytime soon about the world losing focus on them. You know, and but what we're still, you know, and I just think women's stories are really, really fascinating because it's just then you can take a different angle at the history that we've all learned, and I was never interested, to be honest, with political history or straight up military history. I mean, I know it. I had to learn all of that, but I'm much more interested in social history, material history, just the lives of ordinary people, right? Like just the lives of regular people are massively more interesting to me than the lives of the great and good. For all that I've written two books that have kind of this royal theme, if you've read them, you'll notice that the royals aren't in the books. What I'm talking about is kind of the contrast between their lives and the lives of my characters, and how these great royal events, in this case, both the Queen's wedding as Princess Elizabeth in 1947 and her coronation in 1953, was there any point where those events touched the lives of ordinary people, and in what ways? That's what I find interesting. You know, the royals themselves, I mean, I think the Queen was a fascinating lady, but I could never write a book about her because her interior life is a complete mystery to me, and I think is a complete mystery to almost everyone she ever met, with the exception of her closest family and friends. And because that's the only way she could survive living in the fishbowl as she did for so long, she had to have some distance. But I can't write her, how can you write someone's story if you can't understand what was going on in their inner life? And also, I always felt it would be a little too nosy. I mean, she's, you know, I love the Queen, and you know, a lifetime of service isn't enough. We have to have people kind of crawling up inside her brain and trying to figure her out. No, and another reason is her life was just so well known and documented. And this actually, it's a different question I've turned to answering, but I get asked often why I'm not writing biographical historical fiction. So why I'm not saying fictionalizing the life of Eleanor Roosevelt, or or say Princess Margaret or someone like that. And the problem is that their lives are so well documented and so well known that there's really no wiggle room for me there. And whereas with my characters that I create, it's almost like me doing the Dr. Evil thing. But I have full control over these people, and I can do what I want with them. I'm still constrained by historical events. I'm not going to play around with the events of, say, the First World War, but what happens to them within that framework is completely under my control. And so, you know, this is a very roundabout answer, but the history that I write, I want it to entertain, but I also, there's a level where I want it to inform as well. So a much more digestible version of maybe the history that some of us were, I mean, I loved history in school, but I happen to have really great teachers. Not everybody gets great history teachers, and then you're left with a really indigestible form that is like just, you're being fed spoonfuls of bran, right? Oh, here's some dates, and here's some battles, and here's a long list of other meaningless facts for you to memorize, without any of the good stuff, right? And, there I'm influenced by my late father, who taught history at Trent for something like 40 years, and then later in his life at University of Victoria. And he could make anyone care about the two wars because he was so engaging and he was so interested in telling the stories of the ordinary soldiers and officers. And there's just so much that's interesting there. I remember a few years ago I did a talk at one of my kids' schools, and it was my son Matthew's school, and he was just dying with horror that I was there. It was the most mortifying thing ever. But his history teacher had asked me to come in, and I said, I'm coming in, and you'll have to live with it. And then I was telling the kids, they were asking questions about the war, and one of the fastest ways to get through to teenage boys, for example, is to gross them out. And so I said, want to hear about what life was like in the trenches, okay? Anybody here with a weak stomach? Don't worry, I'm not going to go on about it. And I was like, let me just tell you what life was like in the trenches. It was pretty bad. And the men in the trenches, a lot of them were boys, and they were the same age as you, or maybe if you have older brothers, right? So, and that was, they were engaged. It's not hard to engage people in history, and the same with historical fiction. I think that's why it's so popular. And when it's good historical fiction, then it can have a transporting effect on people. And I think that's the way we're keeping, with one of the many ways we can keep memories of say, the two world wars alive. There, okay. We're going to put a line under that question because I've just wandered all over the place there. Oh my goodness.
Well, I'd like to keep you wandering. Have readers' interpretations of your characters ever surprised you?
Yeah. We were talking about this earlier. So, in the in the book The Gown, the character of Miriam, so she's a survivor of the Holocaust, and she's one of the embroiderers at Norman Hartnell's, who helps to create Princess Elizabeth's wedding gown. And she later goes on to become this very, very renowned textile artist, so renowned that she has her work exhibited at the Venice Biennale and at the Tate in London. And I guess I did too good a job of describing Miriam and her work, because even the gown came out like 7 years ago. It can't maybe be 7. Yeah, no, it's 7. 7 years ago. And I still get emails from people saying, I was in London, I went to the V&A, I couldn't find the Velvet tapestries that you talk about, I'm so disappointed, and I can't find any record of them on the internet, and I'm just wondering where they are. And at that point, I have to write, like, I'm so sorry, I made it all up. And, with the proviso, and I do say in the book, in the afterword, and so on, but not everybody reads the afterword, that, she's a fictional character. She's a fictional character. Her friends are fictional characters. She marries a fictional character from one of my other books, which should cement the fact that she did not exist. What she is a reflection of that. I went looking for a Miriam when I was writing the book, a woman, a French survivor of the Holocaust who went on to renown as, say, a textile artist or a fine artist. And there wasn't any one towering figure that I could pick out, even to base Miriam on. So I invented her out of whole cloth. And since then, people have sent me information about other artists who were perhaps less well known, but who were textile artists at the time. And it's funny how their work invariably, when I then look it up, is very similar to what I imagined Miriam's would be like. But yeah, no, there was no Miriam. And I also feel so badly writing back to people saying, oh gosh, I apologize, but she's not real. So, which is why in Coronation Year, in the author's note, I come right out and say, I made up the blue line. It does not exist. You will not find it when you go to London. You'll find a building on the spot that looks very similar. It's not the blue line. Just so I don't get any angry emails from people. Like, I went all the way to London and I can't find this place.
Well, my next question is all about locations. Have you traveled to the locations you write about, and how does place influence your narrative?
So all of them, which is hugely self-indulgent of me. I will say, when I was writing Summer in France, again, I was at home with 2 little kids. I was on this extended unpaid mat leave, and I didn't have enough money to buy myself a laptop. So I was relying heavily on memories of the years I spent living in England. And then for the scene set in France, I was a guide at Vimy Bridge in the summer of 1989. So, and spent time in northern France. And so that's what I had to rely on. But then with the later books, I was able to, justify the expense of going to the places that I write about. In some cases, if they're places I know to a certain degree, I will wait until I've written the first draft.
Oh.
Then I go back and I go through every place that I describe in the book. I revisit it and make sure that my observations are correct. Again, allowing for the distance and time. So with Our Darkest Night, I wrote it when nobody could travel, I wrote it when nobody could travel. Before that, I had done one initial. I've been to Italy and Venice many times because my husband's family is from the Veneto. And so I kind of had my first impressions, and then I had another trip to kind of layer on those impressions. But every place that I write about, I've been to. And if it is a made-up place, it has its origins in somewhere real. So, the buildings I write about may not currently be the buildings that, they may have another use or may have changed. But at some point, a building stood in the spot that I'm describing and was used for something like the purpose that I ascribe to it. In Our Darkest Night, the places, I make up the village of Mezzocello because I needed a specific spot, kind of in the foothills of Monte Grappa, and I based it on a village where my husband has cousins living, but it wasn't quite right. And I also didn't want to, Our Darkest Night was inspired by the true story of my husband's grandparents who sheltered Jews in their attic, not really an attic, but the upstairs of their farmhouse in the latter years of the war. And because their priest had asked them to, and the priest in the entire village in 2010 posthumously for the father, and I'm just blanking on his last name, which is terrible. But the village of Sons and Nonne, they were made righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem. And so there's a real story there, and almost everyone involved had died. So I had no opportunity to go back to interview, to talk to people. So I had to fully fictionalize the book and just make the real story my inspiration, and for that I had to go and create a separate village. But it's very much inspired by the real places, the real farmhouse where my late mother-in-law grew up. All of those are woven into the story. Because I find maps fascinating, and every book starts with me poring over maps and finding where my characters will go and what does everything look like. And the handy thing about writing books set in Europe and old cities is a lot of those cities endure even after 50, 100 years. Google the Blitz was very inconvenient for me as a writer because it destroyed chunks of the city, but Google Street View plus historic maps gets me really far, and then I always follow up with trips. And and so my husband he's hoping I do, he loves the idea of books set in Italy because then he goes into a translator.
That's fabulous.
Yeah. So there's a lot of travel involved. That is not strictly speaking necessary, but I like to feel, that's what I tell myself as I'm paying my credit card bill for the airfare, that I really need to go, and it's absolutely a necessary expense.
I could justify
Yeah.
that. I would go there. I'm going to shift gears a little and talk about any guidelines and hopes and inspiration you can give to emerging writers. But so what qualities do you think emerging writers really need to develop most?
You have to be a reader for starters. It's surprising how many people I run into are interested in writing books, and then I say, well, what do you love to read? And they get a little stuck. And I get it. You know, the reading it's something that's harder to do these days. We're so distracted by our phones and all the flashy things around us. But you really need to read and read a lot. Like that's the first and best recipe. And the second thing is you need to be a curious person. You know, if the rare occasions where I read a book that doesn't move me and that leaves me feeling kind of like flattened, my suspicion is that the person who wrote it is not terribly curious about other people and their interior lives, and it kind of will tend to bleed through. So yeah, like it's and what I would also tell people to do, which is something I didn't do and I wish I had, but I was so anxious when I started writing that I would be terrible at it, and that I would fail, and so I didn't tell anyone. I told my sister, I'm very close to my sister, I told my sister, and she was seeing examples of this work in progress long before I told my husband. Not because he's just the greatest guy, he's lovely, but I just, for whatever reason, I wasn't quite ready to share it. It was like this little secret that I wanted him to have a book to read. And when I finally did tell him, he was clueless. He had no idea why I'd been sitting there typing away at the computer for hours. Bless his heart. But you know, he's always been kind of my biggest booster. But what I wish I'd done in retrospect, and I think would have made the journey a lot easier, was to seek out fellow aspiring writers from the beginning. And you know, again, libraries are wonderful for this. Like most libraries, if they don't have a group for aspiring writers, most librarians do not need a lot of encouragement to like, well, why don't we try setting one up? Let's see who comes out. And it's by sharing your work and your ideas with a small group of people you trust. That's a wonderful way to kind of bring your work forward and to identify any issues in a kind of a safe environment before you're sending it out to the wider world, where people will be not pleasant if they identify any issues in your work. Today I do that. I will say when I'm writing my books, I have a circle of writer friends. I think their work is, Kate Quinn and Janie Chang are two of my closest writer friends. We've gone on tour a number of times together. And whenever I'm hitting a brick wall with plotting or whatever, we have a Zoom call. And the two of them, I mean, Kate jokes that she can plot anybody else's book, her own. You can look right here. But give me 20 minutes, I'll plot your book for you. Or I'll work out all the thorny plot problems, and Janie as well. And then closer to home, like Karma Brown is one of my closest friends, and I think we probably talk every day, and often it's this book is killing me and I don't know what to do. And she has suggestions for me and vice versa. So that's a seek out, and if you're feeling a little shy about going into the library and so on, there's online groups you can join. Although I would always say, be cautious about sharing your work with total strangers, because the last thing you want to see is discover somebody's like stolen your work in progress, which I think is a rarity, but you can never be too careful. Especially in the anonymous world of online. It's one thing sitting in a library filled with your neighbors, that's, I think, a safe environment. But in submitting your work for, when I say criticism, I don't mean somebody sitting there and saying, you stink, right? That's not it. It's criticism in the sense of, I do this, I call it the hamburger criticism, which I give to my children. Rare occasions they ask my opinion on what they've done. I don't look, as a rule, I don't look at their work until after it's marked, because I think that's unfair, and my family's full of teachers who would shame me for doing it. But the hamburger criticism is you start with, this is something I really loved about your work, and then you move on to the meat of it, which is, and then here's a few things I think we can work on. Do we always help? We can work on, and then the bottom is like, oh, again, let me reiterate how fabulous this was. In the middle, though, is the criticism, and So if you're lucky, you'll find somebody who can approach it that way. Certainly that's how my editor approaches criticism for me, where she'll say, loved this, this, this. And then now, here are some things we are going to work on. And then it's boo, three pages later. And then again, reiterating, I love this book so much, I think it's amazing. And there's nothing to do but to tackle it one by one. But that will get your work farther along than if you're just sitting and looking at it and opening it up and rereading it on your own. You need other eyes to do that. Yeah.
Other eyes. How has publishing changed? How has the industry changed since your first book? And that's a really short gap. If we went back 50 years, we could see a huge change, but how has it accelerated recently?
I would say it's changed radically,
Yeah.
actually, since so my first book came out, I think somewhere in France it was 2014, January 2014. So when Somewhere in France came out, ebooks were they were a thing, but they certainly didn't dominate the market. There was no Kindle Unlimited or self-publishing as we know it, not to the degree. Like self-publishing then was kind of you'd have your memoir that you self-published, or there was the church cookbook, right, self-published. But the idea that you could be someone who could sell millions of books self-publishing, that just was not a thing at all. And then second to that was just in terms of the gatekeeping with the industry. You then had, there's since been mergers, so now what used to be the big 6 multinational publishers, all based in the United States, are now the big 4.5, basically, because there's Penguin and Random House are now Penguin Random House, and HarperCollins absorbed Harlequin, and so you see this all over the place. What for the longest time it meant if you wanted to have a book traditionally published, as in have a paper copy of it, at the end of the day that was available in bookstores and had an ISBN, you had to get an agent, and then through that agent would approach the editors in New York. And that's a very difficult hurdle to get past. Getting an agent, even now, is very, very difficult because there's very few agents, and they're all swamped. And my agent, who's incredible, gets something like 50,000 queries a year. 50,000 queries a year. And it ebbs and flows, but I would think that's an average. She and her team respond to everything that's actually, there's a lot of kind of garbage floating through, but everything that's a real sincere query gets an answer. But so there's a lot of noise to get through, but then even once you've got your agent, it still can be an uphill battle to getting published. And it used to be that was really the only way. Whereas now you do have, and it is completely respectable, and a lot of people do it, you can self-publish a book, and through a platform, the most popular one being Kindle Unlimited, and be selling books that look, they're digital only for the most part. They can be printed, but most of their sales are digital. But they have a cover that doesn't look like somebody, made it with crayon. Like it's an attractive cover. The books are well edited, and they sell lots of copies. And that has completely upended the business model for publishing. And then kind of the third thing that's most recent is the phenomenon of TikTok and book talk upending the bestseller list. So right now, I looked at the New York Times list for last week, and I would say 2/3, if not 3/4, of both the hardcover and trade paperback lists for this past week were for authors who were discovered via book talk or TikTok, and then and who were initially self-published. You can't have a self-published book on the New York Times list. They only accept books from major publishers. But what happens is, and this happened to Colleen Hoover, who sold like a bajillion books. And she was self-publishing, she was discovered and selling a reasonable amount of copies, discovered by TikTok. And there was a period, maybe 2 years ago, where I would say all the major best-selling lists, I would say about 2/3 of the books on this list were written by Colleen, which, and she will say, I don't know her, I friends know her, she will say she's as surprised as anyone else that this happened. But, a lot of, I think my mic just might have died on me here, because I was talking for so long, that's why. Yeah, let me turn it off and on. Yes, it is died, but I think, can everyone hear me at the back? I think we're most, it has upended what lands on the bestseller lists to a huge degree. And so people I know who, I won't name people's names, but people I know who would routinely hit the New York Times bestseller list are, and stay there for months, are now not hitting that list, which has a real effect. And then other writers that would never previously have made the list. I'm not talking about, I'm not being a snob about quality, it's just that they just didn't have access, their books just weren't being as widely distributed. Those books are now sitting on that list for months and months, and a lot of those writers are actually Canadian, funnily enough. So it has changed. But if you're interested in writing fiction, now is a pretty good time to have a go at it. It'll be harder than, sure. It'll be harder.
Pause for technical support here.
It's harder than ever to hit a bestseller list, but it's easier than ever to have a book that you can stand behind proudly and say, this is my book that has been published. And, local independent booksellers will take in copies of your books. Most of them will. And, it's a totally legitimate way to have a book published. And I kind of welcome that the gatekeeping is not as monolithic as it used to be, because it really prevented a lot of people from having, it prevented a lot of people from having their voices heard, and this is especially true of women's fiction. As I say again, men have routinely not had difficulty getting published in the past, relative to, say, women's stories. So it has changed, and and we're all learning to not get as obsessed with the bestseller list as we used to. I mean, I will say, there is no better feeling than waking up to the email from your team saying, the numbers came in, the lists came in, and you're sitting at number 1 on the list next week. I would say having my children is getting married. Don't be as surprised as that. That is a fabulous feeling. But it's a vanishing thing. It doesn't last forever. Even Colleen Hoover's books are now kind of not dominating the list. But it's also something that we often rely on in publishing too much on things like bestseller lists, rather than how many people are reading these books. And it's very interesting to see the number of people reading is not collapsed as everyone predicted, and actually younger people too. I mean, are reading. Young women more than young men, unfortunately, but maybe just young men need their own Colleen Hoover, right? And to propel them into the bookstores. Maybe that's there's an opening for somebody. Write the next series of Colleen Hoover books that young men will read, and that'll get in your hands.
Well, that leads me into my next question, and it is about the response to the audiobooks, the digital books, and how has that changed, or has it changed your relationship with your readers?
I wouldn't say it's changed. It's made them more accessible, right? I read a lot on, digitally on an e-reader. My eyes aren't so as good as they used to be, and I can play around with the font size, with the type size, right? It's very helpful. And I also like audiobooks because it's just a different way of reading. I think it's perfectly legitimate. I saw a thing the other day where someone got kicked out of their book club because they were reading the audiobook version. I thought, okay, I don't want to belong to that book club if people are being like that. And but book club, or I love audiobooks for long drives. What's better than to dig in? And my last book, they gave me a multicast recording, which I was terribly excited about. So there's actually 3 different actors doing the different voices, and that was amazing. then it's almost like you're listening to a radio play or something. Yeah, I love it. And I think more people have been able to engage with books because of these different formats, yeah.
I'm going to agree with that one for sure. And yeah, my eyes are tired after reading spreadsheets all day.
Yeah.
And I do like listening to,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, the actors that narrate the
Yeah.
books can really draw you in a different way than your reading could have. I have one more question before we will open it up to you. And the question I have for you is, what role do you see libraries playing in promoting reading and writing in the digital age?
I think libraries are these community centers that, there was a period where everyone was like, oh, the age of the book is dying and what's going to happen to libraries. Well, libraries have been, I think, have been more receptive to change and more on top of the change than a lot of other kind of public entities. And, libraries are, they're a lifeline for so many people. Like, I live in Toronto. There are a lot of people who are, very underserved, in many ways by the community. But the libraries are a lifeline for people to, maintain like an email address or to be able to get in touch with friends and family. But also as this repository of knowledge, right? You can get more from your library now without having to kind of, drive into Toronto and go to the reference library or go to the nearest university library. From here, you have access to the greatest libraries in the world. It's digitally. There's very few resources. I found now, and it gets better every year, there are very few resources that I cannot access from my desk at home. I suppose if I were a medieval historian and looking at really rare, texts, that would be different. But almost everything I need is available. And I think like as a way of democratizing knowledge, that's incredible. And it's still, how should I put it, because it's in the library, because you have trained staff helping, I think the reliability of that information is much better than, say, that's the positive side of the digitization of our lives. The downside is the noise and all of the, frankly, moronic activity that goes on, the substrata, as we call it, of the internet. But there's the richness of what libraries can offer. And it's easy to forget, like libraries have so many programs that don't involve books as such, right? And my local library has a tool library for people. Like you have one weird thing you got to do in your house. You're not going to go out and buy that ridiculous, like, special type of saw that you're going to use 2 times. You go to the tool library, and if they have it, then you can borrow it and bring it back, and it's incredible, right? I just think, my niece is actually starting going into library science next year, and I am so pumped for her. And part of me thinks, when I become a grown-up, I think that's what I want to do for sure. Yeah, it just seems so exciting to me.
I like when I grow up.
Yeah, I'll get there one day.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have a few minutes, and I would certainly entertain a few questions for Jennifer. There's a hand up already.
Yeah.
All right. Could you stand up so we can all hear you, or should I give you the mic? Or
So unlike you, thank you very much. What is the relationship like that you have with your editor, and have you had one editor from the beginning?
I have.
So did you choose what's the process?
Sure. So my first book, Summer and Friends, was bought by an editor then at William Morrow, which is part of HarperCollins, called Amanda Bergeron. And I became very close to Amanda, and we're still close friends. Amanda broke my heart. It was about 6 months before Good Night from London came out. Well, broke my heart. I was excited for her, but also heartbroken because she left William Morrow to go to Berkeley Books. I had to become a senior editor there, and she's gone on to some amazing things. So she was the editor who first published both Emily Henry and Carly Fortune. So Amanda, as far as editors in Europe goes, is white hot at the moment. She's done very, very well. And has sadly moved on from editing a lot of historical fiction. Although I have this idea one day I'll work with her again. And then one of her closest friends actually became my editor after that, a woman called Tessa Woodward, who's amazing. And I've worked with her for every book since, so longer really. I guess probably for 4 books now, and then for the first 3 or 4. And Tessa, so we've never disagreed. People say, I get questions like, what happens if you disagree with your editor, or you hate what she wants you to do, and that's never happened. I make changes to my books. Well, I listen to her, for starters. I think some writers could stand to listen to their editors a little bit more. This isn't aimed at anyone in particular, but just bear in mind that when you say the book you've worked on, so I've written 7 books, I'm almost finished in 8, there's a couple of kind of partially abandoned manuscripts, and then and a novella in there. So that's the sum total of what I've written as fiction. Tessa has edited hundreds of books. She knows more about it than I do. She just does, right? And same with my agent. She's done this for longer than me and has been involved in more books than me. So if either one of these women has something they feel strongly about, I would be a fool not to listen to them. And maybe at the end of the day that whatever they want me to change, that's the hill I'm going to die on, and I'm not going to change it. But I haven't got there yet, and I find it hard to imagine I will. Typically, when Tessa wants me to do something big to one of my books, I kind of already know that she's going to ask me to do it, and it's hard, right? It's hard to throw out pages and pages of book. And so with the gown, I abandoned. I wrote the first draft. She loved it, but the third of the book that was set in the present day with Heather, I completely rewrote because Heather was. She wasn't landing right. Her character, none of it felt right. So I rewrote that, and I'm so glad I did, because as soon as I did, then the book just was. Then I was like, oh, now everything fits together. It's really important to have a good relationship with your editor, and I think one of the best things that a writer can do is to listen to them, right? To really listen to them, and to take their advice to heart, and to take it to heart not just for that book, but the subsequent books, right? I think my writing gets better with every book because I'm learning. I mean, I'm constantly going to school, and my teacher is my editor, my agent, and then also the readers who write to me. And people like certain things, they don't like other things, and they think some things are more successful than others, and I listen. Some things I will disagree with, but for the most part, I think I want to get better and grow as a writer, and that starts with having a really kind of positive relationship with your editor.
Are you able to choose or approve who reads your books?
And
if you don't, are you satisfied with the end result?
Oh, so in terms of who reads the books, like the editorial stage?
The audiobooks.
Sorry, for the audio.
sorry.
I do, I do. So what they usually do is they will, because Harper Collins does their audio, for the most part, they do their audiobooks in-house. So they have a whole studio and everything, and they will, or a production studio, a lot of audiobooks are, the narrators have a closet covered with sound insulation that they're tiny New York apartment, and you sit in there and do the narration that way. They will give me usually anywhere from 3 to 5 potential narrators per voice in the book. And then from those narrators, I get to choose. Now I will say, with every book and every narrator, it has always been crystal clear to me who should be doing the narration. So I kind of sometimes wonder, did they give me the one person I really want, and then a couple of others that maybe aren't quite so, they're still good narrators, but maybe they're not quite so fitted, and then I'm like, I will choose that one. Back here. But it is incredible to, and sometimes the only concerns I have going in often are if they have to do a regional accent or if they have to speak another language, can they speak French or Italian well enough that it won't sound ridiculous? Or if they if they have to do, say, a Brummie accent or a Scottish accent, that they can do it and not sound, like Dick Van Dyke did in Mary Poppins. God bless him, but so bad. I say this too, I should say, I lived in England for years, I'm back there, I'm back in the UK and Scotland often. I can identify regional accents down to the county.
Wow.
I cannot do I can't mimic an accent to save my life. I cannot, I just don't have, I have an ear for hearing, but not for, I can't translate it and make it come out of my mouth, which is maddening. Not that I would ever want to narrate a book, but just to try and describe to somebody what someone who's a Brummie sounds like, or a Scouse accent, or somebody from the West Midlands. I can hear it in my head, and I can't do it, which is frustrating. So. Oh well. Yeah, but it is fun. That's one of my favorite things is when they send me the narrators and I get to choose. Well, I get to choose, but it may be a little bit arranged in advance. And we have time for one more question? Or if I talked everybody out? I think I talked everybody out.
Well, a few things before we close the evening, and that is when you came in, you were handed a little tiny. Somebody hold it up. A little tiny. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So there is a room on the back if you wanted to get a signature from autograph from the author. She's also brought some books for sale here, if you wish.
Yeah, I
as
clung
well.
to my backlist.
It's her backlist. She pulled them out. And also within that little handout, there was, we asked that you give us some input on the evening because we want to have more of these. We're starting a plan to have more of these author talks, but we want to hear from you, not only what authors perhaps, but what other programs you might be interested in the library developing. And would you leave it in there's a basket out there. Craig is here. Hi, Craig.
Yeah.
Craig is out there. He has the basket, if you could just pop those in on your way out. And before we finally conclude this portion, I'm going to call upon Jennifer Carrier to come and present our thank you to the author. It certainly is through her words that we have been reminded of the power of fiction to really preserve memory and to ignite that which we don't know because we didn't experience, but it can ignite our imagination to step into the shoes of characters in your novels. Oh my gosh. I think, whew.
I know.
Yeah, stumble bunnies are happening all over here. So with that, I will have Jennifer come present.
Thank you, that's so lovely of you.
Oh, she's not
Oh my goodness, look at this. So, well, and the only thing is I'll take it home and then have to hide it from my children. As I'm looking, I'm like, oh yeah, that's going to be the Matthew.
Norfolk County
This is lovely.
items and the library, so thank you.
Oh, thank you guys, that's wonderful, thank you so much.
So thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your insights, your candor, and just your time and your comfort in sharing stories with us and how you create your characters and how meaningful the past is to us now and in our future. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So some books are here in case you wish to purchase some of her books, and she'll be here to have a chat,